Thank you, Justin. Happy to be here. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Dawn. I see you here for inviting me. Oh, I get to admit somebody. Okay, so a little bit more about myself. I am a professor here at Humboldt State. I'm the director of the HSU Wildland Fire Lab and the director of the newly formed Humboldt State University Fire Resilience Institute. In those capacities, we're just really trying to uh, connect managers and researchers to, basically find science that's going to be useful to help solve wildfire related problems. This is my 10th year at Humboldt State, and I was actually a master's student here at Humboldt State before returning as a faculty member. I know and love this region very much, and so excited to chat about fire with you all. So let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, here we go. Oh, you guys can answer some of my emails. Okay. So basically, before I get into the talk, this will be somewhat of kind of a primer on understanding fuels management, the strategies that are available to us, and the kind of trade-offs in their use and effectiveness to help limit fire-related damages and negative impacts. Before we jump into this, I know this is probably not any news for many of you, but I just wanted to kind of highlight how unique some of the fire situation is for California. I just updated this based on last year's fires, but 5 of the 6 largest fires in recent California history burned in the past 2 years. So that was 6.7 million acres, 4.2 or 3 of them burned in 2020 alone. And that is a large amount of area that burned. And again, I say this is recent history because it's important to note that this is based on, early 1900s, in this particular case, 1932, based on CAL FIRE's website. And some estimates of how much area burned in California historically prior to, European colonization, Euro-American colonization. One estimate puts it at about 4.5 million acres burned in California annually. So California historically burned very frequently in many places, and it burned fairly extensively on an average annual basis. Again, those are estimates, and we don't really know how much burned. And then 13 of the top 20 most damaging fires have occurred in the state since 2017. 6 were in 2020, and then we've lost over 125 lives since 2017. So as we all are aware, it's a pretty daunting challenge we face. And another way to look at it, I like and think in graphs. This is just a scatter plot of the total area burned in millions of acres, ranging from 0 to 4. And this goes back to 1900, and then all the way to last year in 2021. And you can see there is a steady increase in the area burned over time, and then pointed by these large outlier years of the past 2 years. Here's the 4.2 and 2.5 million acres that burned in the last 2 years. So much higher than we would predict based on this trend alone. So pretty substantial increase in area burned in these past 2 years, but a steady increase nonetheless since the early 70s. And then I like to think about visually, here's kind of Northern California. These are all of the fire perimeters. The ones in the tan, kind of these light colored blotches are fires that burned in before 1985. And then all of the orange burned in since 1985. And this doesn't even include the 2020 fires. Much of this area burned in the August complex and or this area here. And so it's a pretty remarkable increase in the amount of area that it's burned since 1985. And that seems to be about when we started to see an uptick in areas burned. And then by the 90s, that's when people were really noticing and thinking that there was an increase in fire activity. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is, I highlighted Humboldt here, but the Lost Coast area generally, there's been, some fires in the Kings Range here, but by and large, they're, relative to other parts of the state, there's a bit of a lower incidence of larger fires in this region, probably partly due to the moisture that we receive. The fuels are moisture for longer. But one thing that I'd like to emphasize that I'm guessing, sometimes I call it the Humboldt curtain. We could call it the Lost Coast fire curtain. This somewhat resistance to burning historically is bound to change, and that curtain will lift at any point, in the near future. This is a prediction of kind of area burned for California. This is based on Leroy Westerling. He's based out of UC Merced. This was from 2008, his model predictions of fire activity, and just showing that Northern California, Northwestern California generally is expected to have a pretty substantial increase in fire activity, both in the area burned and the frequency of fires that occur in this region. And so we can see, these red blotches indicating, higher fire activity areas, more area burned. And this is a projected 30-year mean projection of burned area 50 to 75 years from now. So I think some of the recent fire activity in Northwestern California, Northern California is kind of in line with these expectations of future conditions. So we know that it's going to continue to get drier and that this fire activity will be maintained. So I feel obligated to kind of briefly mention how we got here. And so a lot of times we might hear different reasons of why we're here. It's actually a number of different factors, one of which is suppression, the act of removing fire, extinguishing fire that started in earnest back in the early 1900s. But that's the direct, extinction of fire by firefighters. But there's also the indirect activity of removing fire from the landscape by, the decimation of indigenous populations and removal of their cultural burning practices. And then on top of that is the intensive logging and forest management, mismanagement, if you will. The removal and clear cutting of many of our forests has altered the structure and composition of forest and other vegetation types. And then I have less, this is more for the Sierras, but intensive grazing activity was another contributing factor. And that might seem odd, but when you intensively graze areas, you allow for trees to recruit. So what was grasslands can transition to forests through heavy grazing. And then expansion of human occupation, wildland-urban interface is the acronym for WUI, or WUI is the acronym for wildland-urban interface. That definitely adds more complexity to the fire problem. And then what's really taken off since 1985, it seems to be that a lot of the increased fire activity is related to increased global temperatures associated with human activities, CO2 release through fossil fuel consumption, that has promoted warmer temperatures, greater drying, and allowing for fires to ignite and spread more to larger areas. So, clearly, I think we can agree that there's a need to shift our thinking and how we can coexist and live with fire. And so we need to kind of shift from a reactive approach where we're basically going out and suppressing fires. Firefighters are going out and suppressing fires, to a proactive approach where we are limiting, reducing fuels and limiting the amount of damage that fires can do to communities and natural resources. And one thing that I like to emphasize, and I haven't checked this, this statistic in the last few years, but most fires are put out by firefighters. 95% of fires wildfires are kept to less than 10 acres. It's the ones that get big and that we hear about in the news that tend to burn the larger acres, but most fires are still suppressed. And less than 1% of California burns annually. This is probably shifted. It's probably closer to, probably in 2020 is probably closer to 4%, but it's probably approaching 2 to 3, and then uniquely 4% of California burns annually. And then we're seeing increases in fire activity, meaning fire frequency, how often fires occur, the size of these fires, and in some cases, the severity of fires. And by severity, what I mean is the amount of vegetation change. So after a fire comes through, what proportion of the vegetation that was there previously was killed by the fire, or at least, killed by the fire, removed. And then, the increases in damages and costs with these fires are pretty astounding. And one of the major issues is that, we're still treating a very small proportion of California's forests and other vegetation types, much less than 1%. So let's say wildfires are burning, somewhere 2 to 3% area, we're burning much less than 1%, or we're treating much less than 1%. Hopefully, we are in this process where it's shifting, and there's a lot of cool initiatives where we're trying to treat, up to 1 million acres in a year, but we're not there yet. And so I think this circumstance, highlights that we aren't coexisting with fire, right? We don't have that yet. It's something we're aspiring to. So one of the things I like to emphasize is that, I like to, maybe I'm optimistic by nature, but I tend to think about, being active and thinking positively and trying to affect change. And I think coexistence with fire is very possible. And we know from historical practices of indigenous burning, they were able to coexist with fire. And I'm optimistic that we can learn to do that as well. Reignite that ability to coexist with fire. To do that, we need to understand that fire is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's California. We are in a very fire-prone state. and the absence of fire is not a solution, uh, and that we need to recognize the risk. It can be reduced, but it cannot be eliminated. And we can use science and our understanding and practices that have been successful previously to employ strategies, employ fuel treatments to reduce these negative impacts. And so trying to develop human communities that are more fire adaptive is necessary. And so to do this, we may need to kind of reevaluate our values in some senses, and allow for some trade-offs where they're acceptable, but trying to maintain and prioritize ecological integrity, and as well as community protection. And one thing that that's really exciting about the fire community is how collaborative they have become in many instances. And so in order to kind of coexist with fire, I think we can only enhance our collaborative nature and working across different boundaries and different groups. And so folks like Friends of the Lost Coast are a crucial part of this equation. And so, the Forest Service and other the Forest Service has a phrase of all hands, all lands. And I like that phrase because it does signify that collaborative spirit of trying to affect change, positive change. And so I think, the science, a lot of the science is out there. And so we can build upon that and inform best practices to affect the change we want to see. And then one of the things that I'm particularly excited about is this opportunity to really revitalize the use of fire in all of its forms, whether it's prescribed burning, cultural or indigenous burning, or through managed wildfire. And so this managed wildfire it's a term that isn't really a technical term, but it's the idea that you can utilize wildfires to kind of have positive benefits. It used to be called wildland fire use fires, but that terminology has gone away. One thing that I did forget to mention is that I'm also a chair of the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council. And this is directed by Lania Quinn Davidson, who you may have heard of. And she has just been awesome at leading the charge and getting people together and really just developing ideas and structures that have really taken over most of the Western US, whether it's prescribed fire councils or her latest project is developing prescribed burn associations. And so prescribed burn association is this group of private landowners that get together. And I know there's a Southern Humboldt one, if maybe you all are familiar with. And so I think these are the types of structures and systems of people that will really enhance and revitalize the use of prescribed fire. So one thing that I like to emphasize, well, first, if you can't escape a fire class without, or fire talk without seeing a triangle in some form. Fire professionals are delta files. They love triangles. Here's a couple of common ones. One is the fire triangle, just showing the ingredients to sustain fire: fuel, heat, and oxygen. And then over here we have the fire behavior or the fire environment triangle. And again, we have fuels, topography, and weather. And these are the kind of broad categories of factors that affect how fire behaves. Fire behavior is how fast is fire moving, how much energy and heat is it releasing, and then how tall are the flame lengths, are some of the common measures of fire behavior. And one thing that I like to emphasize is that with the fire behavior triangle, we can't really change topography. And I always make some some joke about West Virginia. Maybe in West Virginia you can change the topography, but in most places that's not an option, and nor is it desired in many cases, in almost all cases, I would say. And then the weather, we can't change the weather, even though we are changing the climate. And even though we really do need to address the climate change piece of this problem, that is going to be a longer arc solution. And so if we're looking for more short-term to midterm solutions, really the only thing we can do is alter fuels. So, the emphasis is on how can we treat fuels in a way that promotes, positive outcomes. The other thing that I wanted to kind of just give you a little bit of an overview on some terminology. We use the term fuels. What are fuels? They're just it's just plant material, right? Living and dead plant materials in all of its different forms and all the different species of plants that contribute fuels. And so often when we're talking about fuels, we divide them up. There's canopy fuels, surface fuels, and then ground fuels, which is kind of like the forest floor duff. So litter and all of these surface fuels about 6 feet and below are considered surface fuels, and then the canopy fuels are above. And so a couple of terms that might come up that I wanted to explain. Fuel loading. This is just the amount of mass of fuels per unit area. So how much fuels are out there in a given area. Fuel bed height is how high are those fuels on, and this is surface fuel bed height typically. Just how elevated are the fuels? Is it really narrow? Is it just a really, why am I spacing on the word? Is it a shallow fuel bed of maybe Douglas fir needles, or is it a bunch of, kind of jackstrawed branches and logs that are well elevated over above the surface? Canopy base height is another term. This is basically the height from the bottom of the surface fuels to the base of the canopy. In this case, we don't have much of a canopy here, it's just these 2 trees, but kind of the average or crown, the height to the lower part of the crown. And then canopy bulk density is just how much mass per unit volume is the crown, is the canopy. So how much fuels do you have in the canopy of a forest? And so these are important for understanding fire behavior, because the more fuels you have, especially if it's finer or smaller fuels, the more intense a fire can be. And then the same with fuel bed height, the deeper the fuels, especially if it's really small, fine fuels, the more intense and rapidly spreading the fire can be. Canopy base height gives us a sense for how susceptible a fire can move from the surface to the crown. So we call it a crown fire when it's burning through the tops of the trees. And then canopy bulk density gives us a sense of how fast that fire is going to move as a crown fire through that system. And so I bring this up is because if we're going to manage fuels, we need to focus on reducing fuel loads, reducing fuel bed height, increasing crown base height, and reducing canopy bulk density. So, thinking about fuel treatments, I think it's a fuel treatment is anything with the intentional alteration of the fuel complex to modify fire behavior and negative impacts from fire. So there's a variety of things that we need to consider when we're thinking about what types of fuel treatments we're going to implement and what type and where to implement them. And so we want to understand the vegetation types, what species are there, what was the historical fire regime is really informative, especially if we want to maintain the ecological integrity of some of these forests. Even though with climate change, that kind of historical analog of the past may not be as quite as appropriate, it is still very informative. And then things like weather, local weather, topography, proximity to communities, and ownership, right? I think we still want to try to address limitations and objectives of local landowners, whoever those may be. And so I mentioned this already, if we want to affect change on fire behavior, we need to reduce surface fuels, increase crown canopy base height, decrease crown bulk density. And in areas that had historically frequent fire, we would want to promote large trees that were resistant to fire, species like redwood or Douglas fir as well. Now, when we think that's at a stand scale, so we're really good at understanding what we need to do at a small scale. But once you get into a broader landscape, like, the Lost Coast region, we have to think, it gets a little more complicated. But some of the science and modeling exercises from different regions, kind of say that, well, we don't necessarily have to treat it all to have an effect. And some have said that if we can treat about 15 to 30% of the landscape, then that might be sufficient to affect some positive benefits. So that's kind of encouraging that it doesn't have to be, well, we would never be able to treat 100%, but it doesn't necessarily have to be closer to 100%. And there's a lot of value in creating kind of patchiness or heterogeneity in the fuels to kind of break up that fuel structure and then it have its effect on fire behavior and effects. And then the hard part is like, where do you prioritize? So some modeling exercises can really help you pinpoint, okay, these areas might be where you might be able to get the biggest bang for your buck type, so to speak. And again, there's always this need to emphasize the ecological and ecosystem services of landscapes. But in some areas, specifically around communities, there may be a need to have some trade-offs where maybe you're thinning out a forest a little bit more to protect a community than you would otherwise desire. So what types of tools do we have? I mean, clearly we have prescribed burning as an option. This comes with, benefits and drawbacks, but by and large, prescribed fire is really effective at reducing surface fuels. So that is what it can do. It can reduce, surface fuel heights. It can increase crown canopy base height as well. And it can reduce the density of the stand to some degree, but we know that it can be challenging to implement burns because of narrow windows. So if the conditions aren't right, you're out of prescription. And then sometimes, even though prescribed burning can do a really good job at reducing fuels, existing surface fuels, it doesn't always do a great job at thinning out the forest sufficiently to, have the most effectiveness. Another option is thinning. Clearly, this is very effective at, altering the crown fuels, the canopy fuels. It can reduce stand density very well. You can be very selective in the species that you remove. But clearly, as this picture kind of shows, when you thin, in a lot of cases, you're going to accumulate, you're adding fuel loading to the surface. And so in some instances, and the research has shown this repeatedly, thinning only can actually be worse than doing nothing. There's one recent study in Oregon that has shown, an area that was just thinned did have, positive outcomes, but in many other studies, thinning only was more damaging than no treatment. So, a lot of the science has shown that the best strategy is to thin and then follow that up with burning. Could be prescribed burning or pile burning, anything that reduces that surface fuel accumulation. And while I say that this is probably the best strategy, this is often limited to certain forest types, specifically areas that historically had burned very frequently. And one example is like, well, if you thin and burn a Sitka spruce forest, you're really not going to mitigate change. Sitka spruce have really thin bark. If a fire occurs, even a low intensity fire, you're probably going to kill the Sitka spruce, and you may not affect that much change in the landscape. For the sake of time, I'm going to kind of skip over mechanical mastication. That's another treatment that can kind of chew up and shred small trees and shrubs. It is altering the fuel structure, but you're retaining those fuels and they're accumulating on the surface. And so it can be an effective first entry. And then again, you could follow up with prescribed fire to reduce those fuels. But it's another strategy. And then the last one is using wildfires where appropriate and where safe and has the potential to do limited damage. You can allow wildfires to burn. And this, may seem somewhat counterintuitive, but in many instances, under the right circumstances, the right conditions, you can get a lot of positive fuel reduction treatment through allowing wildfires to burn. And then obviously there's still fire suppression. I think, there will always be the need to protect communities and to suppress fires where communities are at risk. But, our ability to use suppression is declining and it's a level of effectiveness, and it's often kind of a stopgap measure. So where we put out fires, that's a loss of opportunity in reducing fuels. So it's kind of managing that, being adaptive in managing, where do we suppress fires? Where do we allow fires to burn to do good work? I'm going to skip that one. And so one of the main issues is increasing the pace and scale of fuel treatments in all their forms. That's the challenge that is really what we face. So I'm encouraged by a lot of the new legislation and budgets by the state that are increasing funding to support the, increasing the pace and scale of fuel treatments. I think there's room for other incentives, finding ways, markets for small diameter wood to help incentivize additional fuel treatments. And then obviously expanding prescribed fire use and the use of managed wildfire. The one thing that I like to emphasize is that, to remember that fuel treatments are not a one and done kind of move on type of thing. They require maintenance. And one thing that we, living on the coast in a very wet, environment is that, where it's wet and relatively warm, you're going to, productivity is higher. So fuels reaccumulate rapidly. So one study I was involved with in the Sierra Nevadas indicated that in mixed conifer forests, you can, expect in some cases the fuels to recover within about 7 to 10 years. And so what that is on the coast, I don't know if we have good estimates. And so there's real need for looking at what's the longevity of effectiveness in prescribed fire and other fuel treatments here on the coast. And it's something that we're starting this summer. I'm gonna have a graduate student look at kind of the long-term effectiveness of prescribed fire in the Klamath Mountains, but we could easily do something along those lines here on the coast. So the, areas that have been treated will require some level of maintenance, hopefully at much lower cost and a much easier implementation. And one thing I like to emphasize in areas that have burned, it's like utilizing those areas that have burned in say a wildfire, and following up treatments to maintain that benefit of a wildfire where it did good work. And then one thing that I like to mention is, like, even though you treat an area, there are always circumstances where they're not going to be effective. You know, this is especially true on very windy, when we get those easterly winds, those very dry, kind of clam tannas, they call it, they're referred to up here. But they can really compromise and limit the effectiveness of fuels treatments. And then, just the long distance dispersal of embers can also reduce effectiveness. So I just wanted to conclude by saying, fire is inevitable here on the coast. I think we can really leverage this circumstance to try to really be proactive and affect change, to promote a coexistence with fire. In order to do this, we really need to increase the pace and scale of which we're doing fuels treatments. And it's, one of the positive outcomes of our current situation is the motivation to affect that change. So I thought, I'm kind of running a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I did want to just give a little bit of a primer on the type of research we do at HSU. For those of you unfamiliar, we have an indoor burning facility here on campus. It's the Wildland Fire Lab. It's a educational lab, so I teach, using the lab, but it's also an active research lab. And so it's a great venue to teach students and the public, kids of all ages. I've never seen anybody bored in the fire lab. But on the research front, we have burned over 500 different species of litter throughout the US, and in some cases, species from other countries. And we now have a database of over 500 species. We've published over 20 different papers, often in collaboration with other students as authors. And so it's a great resource to engage people in fire science. And one of the recent papers we burned, I think it was something like 20 of the different conifer species that are pretty common in the Western US. And we developed this map here, and we developed a fire resistance score for each of the areas based on the species that were present. And, one of the unique things we found is that redwoods are among the highest in their resistance to fire, which is somewhat obvious, but it was interesting to see that the combination of flammability traits of the litter and other traits of those species confirmed, this large resistance to fire. Another project that we have going on is funded by Save the Redwoods League, and it's following the 2020 fires in the Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, and Big Sur area in young coast redwood forests. So we're trying to determine how the effects of stand conditions related to fire severity. So here's a picture of a pretty intense fire. We see the redwoods all epicormically resprouting from the bole and the crowns. And many, we're still working on this data. Jackson is a student working with me, and he's beginning to delve into the data. So hopefully we'll have some good results that are relevant for redwood forests here and in other regions. Another student that's working with me, Heather Ricard, she is collaborating with the Karuk and the Forest Service, Mid-Klamath Watershed Council, and the Nature Conservancy. And she is examining the effects of prescribed fire on legacy tree mortality. These are the old and large tan oak, black oak, and madrone. Here's a giant madrone here with a nice fire scar. And so these are very culturally, important plants, trees. They were often managed historically by tribes, and they are re-engaging with that management. And so one of the concerns, though, is when you reintroduce even low intensity fire, some of these large legacy oaks and madrones tend to topple and fall after prescribed burning. So we're trying to characterize, what is the proportion of these trees that are dying following prescribed fire, and then what are the factors contributing to that, to their death. And so there's other projects we're working on, but I think those are the most relevant for this audience. But I did want to do a little plug for the HSU Fire Resilience Institute. Here's a little website. If you want to email me, you can get onto the list and just stay in tuned and find ways to engage with to help promote fire resilience. And then one last plug is we're transitioning to Cal Poly, and part of this transitioning, we're establishing a new applied fire science and management degree program with emphases in indigenous burning, rangeland fire, restoration, botany, wildlife, and geospatial analysis. So if you know of any young minds that, or any minds that want to enroll as a student, we'll be starting this up in 2023. And with that, I'm sorry I went a little long, but I would love to entertain some questions. Hopefully that wasn't too much, too fast.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Yeah, let me.
And thanks to everybody for joining us tonight. Looks like we got a couple questions that have appeared in the chat. I'm going to change the security features now so that folks can unmute themselves and also start their video to ask questions. So I see that Christina Huff, one of our board members, had a couple questions. One, she was wondering, can we bring elementary students for field trips to the fire lab? Is that something you all offer at HSU? Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, we do that. I do that as often as my schedule allows, and sometimes I can get graduate students to help, give a little demonstration. But yeah, we're always open. The last one I gave was last semester to a group of Hoopa Valley High School students. So yeah, we've had all ages. So yes, please reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. Yeah, and she also asked which agencies are receptive and proactive. I don't know if Christina, you want to offer any more on that question, or if you can run with that, Jeffrey, but that was the other question that Christina proposed. Yeah, yeah, I think everybody's transitioning to more proactive activities. I think there were certain groups that were more proactive than others. I think the Park Service, National Park Service, and state parks to some extent in California were more proactive in kind of the use of prescribed fire. And so even CAL FIRE back in the 70s had a much more kind of active vegetation management program. And so it's really nice to see that they are kind of really shifting back to what they used to do. But it's happening on all fronts. Like private landowners are much more engaged with fuel reduction treatments, the Forest Service, obviously. So I don't want to rank them, even though I'm ranking them in my mind right now. But I don't know if that addresses your question, Christina. Thank you. So one question I had, and I'd like to encourage anybody else after this to unmute yourself or turn off your camera and join us for a question, or just put something in the chat. But you mentioned modeling tools as one of the things that land managers are using, or fire managers rather. And I'm wondering if most of those modeling tools are available for individuals and for property owners, or generally is that intended for more fire management specialists? Yeah, so majority of the fire models that are actively used by managers are freely available to the public. they're not the most user-friendly things. So they do take some level of expertise and education to learn them, but I think a real go-getter could figure it out slowly.
Any links that we could share with people for where they can find modeling tools if they wanted to play around with that for their situation in Homestead?
Yeah, so let me think, what is the, let me think of the kind of warehouse. There's a federal warehouse. Most of these products were developed and are maintained by the Forest Service. And so I'm spacing on the name right now. Let me think about it and I can, oh, frames. Let me look up what frames stands for.
All right. And looks like we got another somebody with their hand up here. So yeah, if you, feel free to join us with, maybe take your screen share off too, if you could, Jeffrey.
Oh, sure.
All
Yeah,
right.
you guys don't want to read my emails?
There's Dawn. Looks like
Dawn needs some extra ones.
I do need some more for today, especially our first day of classes, you guys. Thanks so much, Jeff. I know you're super busy and it's really great to hear what you guys are doing across the street from us up in Humboldt. But I'm going to ask you two things as they relate to sort of the Lost Coast. And you mentioned this before, like this area of the coastline hasn't really been, knock wood, impacted as much as other areas due to sort of massive wildfires. And I was wondering if the advice you give people is different, like if you're living in the middle of the Sierras versus if you're living in the Lost Coast, and how is that different? Just wondering.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I wanted to kind of elaborate on, and I just didn't have time to incorporate it. So thank you. The perfect question. To me, it's a really challenging question too, because I think here on the coast, conditions are different. While it's drying out relative, it's not as drying as fast as interior parts of California. And so I think there's still always going to be a little bit of a buffer, but I think at some point that won't be the case. And so that's the kind of why I was emphasizing trade-offs. I think historically along the coast, some of the vegetation types, the forest types, didn't burn that frequently. And so if we look so one way we can characterize the fuel conditions is to look at the departure from the historical conditions. And so on the coast, we haven't departed all that far from what happened historically because it was relatively infrequent. Now, I say that with the exception of redwood forests, because they, in many redwood forests, they had burned fairly frequently, with some exceptions immediately around the coast. But that was probably because of indigenous burning practices. And so some studies estimate that redwood forest burned around every 10 to 12 years in a lot of places, with some variation throughout the range. And so it's a very challenging question. I think for redwood forest and Douglas fir forest, I think there's opportunities where we can borrow from more interior forests and still have positive, maintain the ecological integrity of these ecosystems, but also trying to limit the potential damage. And that's why I was like, especially around communities, that's probably where you're going to want to try to emphasize community protection versus, kind of ecological integrity to some extent. Right. And so, and that is, it is challenging because, I'm trying to think of like some examples, I think, but by and large, I think if given the drying trends, these areas will be very receptive to fire. It will happen, I think, in our lifetimes. I think we'll see a major fire in this region in the next 10 years, I would guess, if I had to wager something. As sad as that is. So it's really about, what's that level of potential damage you're willing to accept as a group. And so prioritizing communities and trying to focus on those areas to protect them, and then creating a condition that would allow for maybe some benefits of wildfires burning and kind of the broader matrix is,
Mhm.
kind of, that's kind of what they're looking to move towards for the Klamath. But, I think it also applies here to some extent.
Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah.
I think that kind of plays into a couple of questions that are coming up on the chat too, that Ramona and Chris both had about, for property owners here, would you say like thinning and burning is still the best practice? Would that be the same advice you would give for on the coast? And yeah, and there's a couple others, but maybe you can answer.
Yeah, great.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think around homes, definitely is a very effective way. So in many cases, it's a fairly, heavy thin. You really want to emphasize that spacing and really reduce those fuels immediately, around homes and properties. But, even extending that out more would be very good, because, if an ember gets in there, that might happen anyway, but reducing that possibility is really what you're going for. So especially if you're in redwoods, Douglas fir, tan oak kind of forests, I think those treatments would still be very effective. Now, whether it's completely appropriate for, kind of the broader matrix is probably up for debate, but I still think it can be quite effective and still be ecologically beneficial.
Great. Another question that came through on the chat is any particular sites or publications regarding treatment strategic prioritization?
Yeah. For this region, no. Not specific to coastal Northern California generally. But a lot of work has been done in the Sierras, some in Oregon, that have used these kind of modeling structures or modeling frameworks to game out scenarios to help highlight prioritization. So those tools can be really effective to kind of highlight where, and sometimes it can be counterintuitive. Areas that would burn, hot, and intensely, you may not want to treat, because they're going to burn hot intensely, and it might not be as cost effective to treat those areas, where maybe in the middle, it might be, where it's like moderately burning intensity, you might want to focus on that because it's easier to be more effective in those areas, and it may not burn as high as severity. So, those are some considerations. I do have, some citations. How appropriate they are to use for this landscape is questionable, but I think it's something that has to be kind of locally derived.
Another question that came through is if only 1% is treated annually, how much needs to be treated today at a pace to really affect positive long-term outcomes?
Much less than 1%. Maybe it's like 0.001, 0.1%. Maybe not quite that less. It's probably, I think it's in the hundreds of thousands of acres annually. So how much would it take? I would suspect probably many millions, tens of millions of acres, not in a year, but over time, if we get within 5 years, if we could treat, if we could treat 5 to 10 million acres, that might show some benefits.
Great. So if anybody else has questions, please put them in the chat. I had another one, which is just, you mentioned that there was maybe some factors that were leading to the mortality of oaks and madrones when doing prescribed burns. And obviously there's a lot of talk about fire being something that can save those trees. And so that was somewhat surprising to hear. And I wonder if you have a sense of what some of those factors are and how bad that
Sure.
mortality rate might be.
I'm glad you asked, because we have, we're still working on this project, but we have some preliminary data. And one of the good things is that we're noticing is that the amount of mortality is pretty low. It's like 5 to 10% of the legacy what we call legacy hardwoods. They don't have to be big to be old in legacy, but so it's about 5%, 10% based on 6 different burned areas that we've sampled. And in most cases, it is the smaller trees that die, not always the biggest ones. But the other factor is areas that have a fire scar. So what we found is that the bigger the fire scar, the more likely that it's going to die in a fire. And the idea is that even with a low intensity fire, that fire gets into that scar, and that scar hasn't burned in probably many decades to maybe a century. And so that wood has just been rotting in there. And if you think about what have happened historically, is that it would have been burned frequently, every 2 to 5 years in many instances, and it would have just chipped away at that rot. But now it's just accumulated. So once a fire gets in there, it consumes it, and then it burns it out, and it probably loses stability and topples over. And so we've seen that visually happen among some of the trees. It's not always the case, but that seems to be the issue. So one part of the study we're trying to implement is a way of remediating. So trying to pull back the fuels around the trees, especially the ones that have scars, to limit ignition and combustion of the scar. And so whether or not that'll work is still to be determined.
And I think Dawn might have had her hand up for another question. Dawn, did you have another one?
Yeah, I mean, thanks again, Jeff, and everyone. You have such great information to share. And I guess one thing that I'm hearing from the group here, and I know from the Friends of Lost Coast, is really just being hungry for more information. And like you said, most of the work that's being done is in different kind of habitats and bigger communities. And Will Harlan came and talked to us last time, and they have a huge community group that's working with all of the different agencies, because that's a real like present danger for them.
Mm-hmm.
And since it is such a unique habitat, and since our community is more widespread, I mean, how would you advise people to really start building this fire awareness community, like to get that information? Like I know that Justin was asking about, like, how do you get the modeling information? How do you do that? I mean, how can we start to sort of build a sort of community of knowledge or a baseline of knowledge about these things that may not be impacting us now, but may very well do that in the future?
Yeah, that's great. And so that is actually kind of what I want the Humboldt State Fire Resilience Institute to be engaged with, is groups like yours and others in kind of coastal northwestern California to help facilitate maybe meetings, to help kind of exchange ideas and successes and failures. I think it's going to be a bit of a trial and error. And like let's try to affect change. Let's see what works, what doesn't. Let's try to emphasize what we think will work in what we do, and then see how that fares. Honestly, that's kind of the best thing. And then as far as like one of the things that I would love to do is to facilitate some of that kind of that modeling exercise. So it's basically me here at HSU doing the fire stuff, and as much as I try to do everything, it's impossible. But I'm encouraged that we'll be hiring a couple new faculty to support the new program, one of which we're trying to get a modeler, a fire modeler. So I can do it. I know how to do it. It's not my super forte, but hopefully we'll get somebody that would be engaged with communities like yourselves and trying to help do that. And so the position is out, and we'll hopefully hire later this spring.
And by modeling, you just mean like study the existing characteristics and then make a prediction, a mathematical prediction about what might happen and when it might happen and what the extent might be. So that modeling is really looking at what the status is now and then building predictions and then sharing them with people that would be impacted by them. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's almost like gaming. So here's what happens if we do nothing. Here's, let's put these treatments out on the landscape. Okay, how does that work? Is it doing what we would like to do? These models are fairly simple and they're far from perfect, but they are the best tools we have. So we might all try to utilize them because it's hard to think at these broad scales and try to,
Right.
And following up on this, sorry, go ahead, Jeffrey.
No, I was just going to say that, even in the absence of that landscape level kind of analysis, I think there's still a lot, at the small stand scale. It's like, okay, do what you can at the small scale in the areas that are high value areas, whether communities or resource based. Still, you got to do those things. And then how can we extend that and build off of that? And I know there's a lot of groups that are seeking some of these CAL FIRE dollars to put in fuel treatments or shaded fuel breaks, and it's like, okay, that's a good starting point. And then, okay, if we do this, what's the next step beyond that? How do we trait the broader matrix to enhance the effectiveness? But sorry, Justin.
I was just going to say, yeah, if you send me some of the modeling options that are available for folks, we could certainly, in following up on this, be able to share that with.
I can give you. So the name of the website that hosts all of these tools is called frames.gov. I was just looking it up, so I can give you that. Did I lose it? There it is. So frames.gov.
Great.
Oh, thank you. And then within there, the tool that does a lot of this landscape level fire behavior modeling is called Farsight.
Farsight?
So, yeah. So if you are really savvy, I think I'd say go for it. It is a bit of a daunting, you have to bring in lots of geospatial data from another website called Landfire, and then you have to have the right informed, kind of inputs of fire fuel moisture and weather conditions. It's not for the layperson. Some skill in knowledge. So, but hey, check it out.
Thank you for that. That's great.
And kind of along with Dawn said, maybe, I teach a class where I try to teach students to do this to varying levels of success sometimes. And so we could, if there's a strong enough need, maybe that's something we could offer as a form of outreach, I'm sure you all are not alone in this. And sometimes even to get some of those CAL FIRE dollars, you need to kind of demonstrate some potential benefits. So it could be good at helping to acquire funding.
Great. Looks like we had a couple more comments or questions in the chat. One was, our local fire safe councils are doing a great job working with CAL FIRE and fire departments so far, and hope we are connecting with you and local fire departments and prescribed burn associations and other HSU researchers. So has there been some communication with some of these different groups with your organization in terms of connecting these dots and starting to build these networks?
It's always happened in kind of fits and starts, but now I see there's a much more, higher frequency of contacts, and I think it is kind of moving that direction. And so, yes, but not enough.
Yeah. And what are other departments in the new HSU Fire Institute?
The other departments? I'm sorry.
I'm not sure this is from the question, so I guess, yeah, if there's anything more to share about the HSU Fire.
So we don't have departments in the Fire Institute. It's kind of its own thing. It's basically a network of existing researchers here at Humboldt, and then in neighboring organizations, and so it's basically composed of researchers researchers and managers. And so anybody's welcome to be involved as like a member. If you send me your email, you can get, kind of on our little email list to get any, communications we release. It's really up and running. I'm still focused on helping partners get some funding to support some research projects, and then we'll shift to more of a kind of outreach phase in the coming years. But I think it's a network of about 10 different researchers here at HSU, and then a bunch of different organizations that are also involved.
And would you share your email again, just in case folks want to follow up with you?
Yeah.
You're also working with
got another comment. Go ahead.
I was just saying you're also working with the Native American Studies program, yeah? So they're playing a large role in it as well.
Yeah. So as part of this new applied fire science and management, we developed a curriculum that in collaboration with the Native American Studies program here on campus. And so it'll be a fire management, science and management degree, and then there'll be an emphasis, one of which will be kind of a Native American Studies focused. And so it's kind of this emphasis on maybe, indigenous fire, the combination. Mm-hmm. There's a number of Native American Studies courses within the core degree program as well.
Thanks.
We got one last comment here. We probably got to let you go here soon, Jeffrey, but if there's any other questions, let us know. Otherwise, somebody says frame.gov looks great. We have Whale Gulch Fire Safe Council here, a community of 60 plus households off the grid in the middle of the coast, bordered by BLM, Lost Coast Forestry, and Sinkyone Wilderness, and are very interested in modeling. So it looks like that's a conversation that's already happening in some of the communities directly bordering the southern end of the Lost Coast. So great news.
Yeah, and maybe, I'm not sure if Alex has engaged with any of these kind of modeling exercises. It might be good to reach out to him and ask him if that work has been done to any extent. I don't know how they are kind of, if they're using that to kind of prioritize their treatments. It's not always used and not necessarily has to be.
Yeah, on that note, Alex Miyagishima is going to lead a fire outing that's going to culminate this fire lecture series, and that's going to be happening in early February on a date to be announced. So for folks tuning in tonight that want to learn more about that and ask questions about modeling of Alex, so we'll have a chance to do so in early February when we get out on Paradise Ridge and look at some of the fuels reduction works BLM's been doing out there and talk about fire history in the King Range region. So stay tuned.
Yeah, please add me to any of your list. I'd love to consider going if I can.
Great, I'll keep you posted once we set that date. So
yeah,
we're probably running long here, so I guess last opportunity here to ask any questions, and otherwise we're gonna move on to our outro. Did you have another question, Dawn, or are you good?
No, I was just saying thanks again. It was really a wonderful sort of overview and talk and introduction into what you're doing up there. And I'm glad we've been able to connect with you. So thanks for taking the time.
Absolutely.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So we're gonna, close things out here now. Thanks to everybody on behalf of the Friends of the Lost Coast and the BLM King Range National Conservation Area. Many thanks to Jeffrey Kane and Humboldt State University for this talk. We hope you found this lecture educational and inspiring, and will join us again next Wednesday, January 26th, from 6 to 7 p.m. for part 3 in our Living with Fire lecture series featuring Jana Valakovic, Forest Advisor with UC Cooperative Extension on fire hardening your home and homestead. And we are also happy to announce that we recently confirmed an event with Alex Miyagishima, BLM Prescribed Fire and Fuel Specialist, to culminate the Living with Fire lecture series with an outing in early February on Paradise Ridge to view recent fuels reduction work, talk about fire history in the King Range, and discuss plans for a major fuels reduction effort currently being undertaken in the King Range National Conservation Area. Stay tuned for a date announcement soon, and thanks again for tuning in tonight. To learn more about Friends of the Lost Coast or to make a donation to support our work, including programs like this lecture series, please visit lostcoast.org. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We hope to see you again for next Wednesday's lecture with Jana Valakovic, 6 to 7 p.m. on January 26th. And until then, good night and all the best from Friends of the Lost Coast. Thanks again, Jeffrey.
Thank you all.
Take care. Signing off.